So first, I want to say welcome, sveiki, as we say in Latvian, and thank you for attending this event. I think most of you were at the IPCC meeting, but we also have some audience members who have joined externally. And so just to say that this will be in English, but es arī runā latviski un var tulkot, ja vajadzīgs. So I'm happy to help with some translation if needed. Uh, so we're here today to discuss climate risks. Let's see if I can get the presentation. Oh, perfect. And this is something actually that was raised in some of the breakout groups and in discussions this week. We all know that climate risks are expected to increase with each degree of warming. Here's some of the consequences for wildfires in the Mediterranean. Here are some consequences for average lengths of droughts in Africa. So, risks in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change are often represented by figures that are called burning embers figures. And this is a slide from the synthesis report that was released last March. And you can see that there is a wide range of risks that are assessed. And we're fortunate actually tonight to have some of the people involved in developing this figure here with us. So if you have any questions about the IPCC and the way that we assess risks, they'll go into a little bit more of that either in their talks or in the Q&A. We know that, in the last cycle of the IPCC reports, there were many advances made in risk assessments. For example, we began to look at how adaptation actions can mitigate risk, or what are the risks from responses, or compound and cascading risks. And these are all things that we'll be discussing here tonight. In Latvia, the National Adaptation Plan lists a variety of risks that need to be considered: fire hazard, proliferation of pests, spread of diseases in the respiratory system, heat strokes, floods caused by precipitation, wind surges, occurrences of disturbances in electricity supply, increased runoff, reduction of frost, eutrophication, and it goes on and on. And we also are pleased today to be welcoming experts working on the CLIMAAX project, which is an EU-funded project that will help provide support so that policymakers can take action on risks. Because as this comic illustrates, it often climate scientists issue warnings, but we don't act on them, and the kingdoms get destroyed, as they say here. But before I begin, we would like to hear from you. So I ask you to get your phones out, potentially, and to either go to this Mentimeter website or to take a photo of that QR code. And we have a question for you. We would like to know what risks you're thinking about and what risks are relevant to your community. We'll give it a few moments. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So let's see if the answers are coming in. So what is the greatest risk your community faces? So it's interesting. Here we have, I think when we ask it like this, we'll note that, well, some of the hazards, climate-related hazards such as droughts and floods, become quite large. There are also social risks, as mentioned, issues related to lack of drinking water, inequality, economic risks. And I think that's very interesting that obviously we in the climate change world often think about the climate shocks, but we need to look at how these are compounded by a variety of other social related issues and that relate to vulnerability and exposure. So the next question is thinking a little bit beyond your community. What are the risks to the region, for example? Here in Latvia, maybe wildfire is not as much of a risk, but as was demonstrated by that first slide, in the Mediterranean, fire is actually a potentially huge risk. So what are the, or you might consider conflict again in the region here. So what are the risks that your community faces? Or sorry, your region, not your community. So we have similar things here today, and we'll have speakers speaking about, as I mentioned, the European region. So we'll get some thoughts on both what's happening in Latvia, but also what's happening across the European region. And finally, and welcome, please come sit. We're thrilled to have everyone. The last question we have for you is this question about response. So what would you recommend, what's the most effective tool to manage the risk that you may have identified in the previous slides? Is it early warning systems, social safety nets, something else? We'll hopefully be brainstorming a little bit about that today as well. So I see adaptation planning, informing people, awareness, risk mapping, nature-based solutions. That's great. So let's see if the speakers today have anything new to say or if they validate any of the kind of common reactions we have here. Although I have to say we have an audience that is full of experts. So great. So we will now transition back to the slides. Quickly give you an outline of where we're going tonight. So we have 4 presentations by a fantastic group of speakers assembled here today. I won't introduce them, but I do hope that when they come up, they will tell us a little bit about themselves and the institutions that they represent. And then we'll all hopefully sit down for a nice conversation with additional experts, one of whom is joining online and one in person, and have a discussion about what we've just heard and also hopefully hear from you and your questions. And just to say, if you are joining online, because there are remote participants, please feel free to ask questions in the comments and we'll also raise them with the speakers. So with that, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Bart van der Herk, who's also the Working Group 2 co-chair of the IPCC, to come and present his talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacinta. Thank you for moderating this session. Welcome everybody. This afternoon there was a small group of the IPCC people that were invited to the Latvian Parliament for the Standard Committee of Environmental Protection or Sustainability in the Environment or something like that. And so we told a bit about what we are doing here and what climate change is all has been reported in earlier IPCC reports, etc. But it was interesting, of course, if you go to a local parliament, a local city or a local region, climate change becomes much more concrete than that global picture of the increase of wildfires and temperatures, etc. And climate change comes also something that is embedded in the daily practice of decision making. We have to deal with a lot of pressures. We get quite often questions, how important is climate change compared to the conflict situation that we have in Europe and social unrest, etc. So there's a lot of contextualization that we need to address. And also in the IPCC reports, we try to produce collections of information on climate change that can be interpreted at a local scale as well. But it's nice to be able to share a bit of what this CLIMAAX project is about, because this is a project funded by the European Commission. I'll say a bit what it is, but it's a scientific project, but with a very practitioner's orientation. But we do definitely hope, or the project coordination definitely hopes, that a lot of science is going to be produced also by this project that can be used in IPCC reports as an example of what the research is actually doing and what it's actually contributing to that you very local information need. The European Commission has, as many of you know, is operating a big mission. We drive the crowd towards a better future. That is, of course, the idea of a mission. And for the mission on climate change and climate adaptation has a very prominent call to ensure that those actors that need to do something on climate change also get support to do so and also get knowledge to do so. And it's really well appreciated that there is a lot of capacity and knowledge and resources in Europe that puts many European countries and regions in a very good position to cope with climate change. Also, Latvia has its adaptation plans, and the Netherlands, where I come from, has a very sophisticated, knowledge base. But there's also a lot of regions that have very much more limited capacity and actually don't really know very well what their climate risk is about, what their climate options is about. And this mission is really putting into the market a couple of research and support projects that have the intent to disseminate the available knowledge towards the regions where it matters to have that knowledge. And this project is that we are discussing is indeed helping regions to make a climate risk analysis for the region. But it has, of course, many shared challenges, as we also have with the IPCC reports. There is, of course, a plethora of risks. So many risks that you need to tackle, to describe at the same time, and that all has to fit in some kind of a single kind of decision, a single kind of policy. There is enormous diversity. The climate risk in every region in Europe is quite different from others. There is an enormous amount of information and data and models. It's really a luxury problem that there is more information to choose from than you ever will need to be able to act. And there is also a lot of, awareness that all these climate pictures and climate assessments, they have often the intent to look at somewhat longer time scales and the long-term evolutions, whereas today there is emergency response actors that need to step up and also produce or support the civil society to cope with climate extremes, and they also want to know what is actually the change in the risk, what is actually the kind of events that we have to cope with, what is actually the kind of governance of our emergency response that we need to be able to be prepared for these risks. So this is many challenges. This CLIMAAX project has a couple of pillars. There is a few people in the room that will describe it in a bit more detail, but the idea that has put in place is that the regions are being helped by making what in the adaptation of in the IPCC assignment would be, say, like an adaptation guideline. Here in CLIMAAX we built what we call a framework to support regions to be a bit more systematic on how they do this risk assessment, and Michaela will explain a bit more on that framework. Very nice that you could come over, by the way, Michaela. There is an online toolbox is being prepared and being developed where people can indeed download data, tools, models, concepts, risk calculation metrics, and that's of course being supplied to all the regions. And not the least interesting, there is also financial support being made available, being aware that a lot of regions or larger or smaller municipalities don't always have the financial or say labor resource capacity to carry out decent risk assessments. And so this fund is actually designed to help a regional authority like a province or a bigger city to recruit specialized consultants to carry out that risk assessment for them with this financial support. Yeah, we also hope we have shared impact ambitions, so to say. We share the idea that some guidance on how to approach such a risk assessment would be helpful. Some kind of that framework, that systematic self-help checklist is really important to distribute. There is in that guidance we will, and Michele will tell a bit more about it, but it is giving an inventory of what are actually the challenges, what are the new kids on the block, what are the compounding events that can come together, what are impact cascades that come together, and what is the support that you need for that. We also share the curiosity about what is actually being done with this research. So in the project, there is a lot of monitoring of how people actually use the support from the project, how it's being picked up by these regions and what they do with it. And that is, of course, a very crucial resource also for IPCC to have much more documentation about effectivity of climate information, effectivity of the policy pathways that come out of it. That is, this kind of project gives us a lot of evidence on measuring effectivity of climate risk assessment and implementation of adaptation policies. And yeah, we also here a large set of case studies is going to be collected that also give a lot of couleur locale, as you say it in proper English. What actually were the attributes? What are the success factors? What could be better? Yeah, I think that is what I would like to say here. Really great to be here. Also very welcome for the group here, and yeah, we will address the questions later. I think both. Today we had a very interesting day in our IPCC meeting. We are here, by the way, for those who are not involved in IPCC, to have about 100 people come together to think about, we are going to produce a report on climate change and cities. And with this group, we are going to decide or make a proposal what should actually be in that report. And we have so many discussions about how diverse cities are if you look at the world. I mean, everything that happens in every city in Africa is so different from what we find in Europe or Asia. But even within a smaller region, a city at the coast is totally different as a city. And then, you know, so many definitions of city, that's another one. But there's of course sort of a paradoxical conflict that you would like to standardize this approach of how to go about these risk assessments while appreciating that enormous diversity and flexibility. And I think both this project and IPCC share that same challenge, I would say. Thank you. I would really like to, or Sinta, is it okay if I just hand over to Michele? Yeah? Okay, yeah, just checking because you're the boss here. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michaela Bachmann, and I'm very happy to present the CLIMAAX methodological framework to you tonight.
Michaela, you should use the microphone.
Ah, yeah, sorry. I hope you can hear me, everyone online also. Good. Yeah, with climate change gaining traction, we will increasingly see situations like these. Wildfires, floodings, snowstorms, storms, drought, and also heat waves. This new climate reality, together with developments in the climate risk field, marks the need for a comprehensive climate risk assessment. These developments happen in climate risk conceptualization. For example, most importantly, the IPCC and IPCC reports, UNDRR, or other reports and frameworks. Most recently, the European Climate Risk Assessment, EUCRA, has been published a few weeks ago. That also plays a role here. Secondly, we have a climate risk management and adaptation offensive happening at the moment. Most importantly, the mission adaptation at the European level, but also generally adaptation plans, strategies, and action happening on a lot of levels. Third, different application levels of a climate risk assessment also require, as we call it, standardized flexibility, as in the framework, but also in the risk quantification itself. And this allows for a state-of-the-art climate risk assessment while meeting the needs on the ground. The innovation now lies in the inclusion and synthesis of all of those aspects, and it's also important to mention the comprehensiveness and the comprehensive aspect of a climate risk assessment, which in CLIMAAX involves climate risk and civil protection also. Our approach was the review of relevant grey literature, the review of peer-reviewed literature, and also expert feedback. But also very important in the CLIMAAX and very unique in the CLIMAAX project is the co-development with our 5 pilot regions. Our 5 pilot regions are currently reviewing and applying the CLIMAAX climate risk assessment framework. And we also have 2 cities here, namely Žilina in Slovakia and Setúbal in Portugal. Okay, I will now go through the climate risk assessment framework step by step. The framework is based on 3 pillars, which are forming the conceptual background, namely the principles, the technical choices, and at the very heart of it, the participatory processes, which are learning, communication, and consultation. This background then fosters the operation of framework steps that guide through an iterative climate risk assessment. The 5 steps are scoping, risk identification, risk analysis, key risk assessment, and monitoring and evaluation. So for the scoping step, I will now go a bit more into detail, step by step. For the scoping step, a user should define their objectives, set the context, and define the extent of the participatory processes, and also allocate ownership, risk ownership, as we call it. Then secondly, a user should explore risk. We will provide explorative maps for this, where the users can explore, for example, hazard, vulnerability, but also exposure. Then secondly, the user can choose the workflow, and we have 6 workflows, and I'm very happy to hear that in this question that Sinta raised before, that there are a lot of hazards that we will cover. So we have the 6 workflows: floods, droughts, heat waves, fire, snow and wind. And finally, the users need to choose the scenario, which we have RCP, SSP, and a combination of RCP, SSP scenarios. Then we come to the 3rd step, the risk analysis step, which is actually the application of our CLIMAAX toolbox, which is very important for the risk quantification. Here, the user can apply the workflow that was chosen in the risk identification step. For this, the user prepares the application, then chooses and accesses data, calculates the hazard, and finally combines it with exposure and vulnerability data. And I will show the output of one of those workflows in a few minutes. This risk outcome then leads to the key risk assessment, where it can be contextualized according to risk severity and urgency. Severity is the extent of potential adverse consequences, while urgency brings in a temporal dimension of the risk. It's also very important to include the stakeholders or also experts here, and to focus on participatory processes, to also bring in qualitative aspects of the risk and complement the quantitative aspect that was calculated in the risk analysis step. So the outcome or the goal of this step is quantitative and or qualitative ranking and prioritization of risks. Finally, we have the monitoring and evaluation. We proposed the evaluation of climate risk assessment, of the climate risk assessment process itself, and the monitoring of the climate risks according to the risk analysis step. And this is the full framework now. The CLIMAAX project is does not directly relate to climate risk management, but it's still important to make a connection of how the key risk assessment can feed into climate risk management. And in our case, we have key risk assessment, the key risk assessment step, which leads to less urgent risks and key risks. The less urgent risks directly go to the monitoring and evaluation step, and the key risks allow or act as entry points that lead to the climate risk management funnel, and ideally lead to adaptation and building resilience, and then can report back to the monitoring and evaluation step. I will now briefly come to the CLIMAAX toolbox also, as it is very central also to the CLIMAAX framework, and show how they work together. So this handbook is not online yet. We have another version online, and this will be online soon. And in the case of the flash floods in Setúbal in Portugal, which is one of our pilot regions, I would like to showcase how the climate risk assessment can be applied at the city level. So the three components, hazard, in this case flash floods, exposure, in this case the exposed infrastructure, and vulnerability, in this case the vulnerable population, come together. And I also have the workflow application of river floods, but this time in Barcelona. The different steps, following the different steps here on the right side, leads to the results that are a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And then you can find it here, depicted here. And the outcome is a financial damage analysis for flood damages for 500-year return period. And then this outcome can be contextualized, as I said earlier, in the key risk assessment step. Finally, the inclusion of own data, which is allowed by the toolbox, and this may be especially relevant also on a city level, allows for more granularity and shows how our motto of standardized flexibility can also come in at the toolbox level. We have opportunities emerging and challenges that remain to be solved in the CLIMAAX framework. So first, the key risk assessment, which is one of the main points of innovation, with risk evaluation according to risk severity and risk urgency. It allows for objective and subjective climate risk evaluation, but also very strongly brings in these participatory processes, as I mentioned earlier. It's also of crucial importance to inform decision-making and finally lead to climate risk management. But this is still a work in progress also. Then the inclusion of climate risk management itself. CLIMAAX is mainly climate risk related, but climate risk assessment, of course, is connected to climate risk management. And including this climate risk management perspective allows to shift the perspective to actions that positively or negatively affect the risk, and therefore there's a feedback also given here. We also have the Pathways to Resilience sister project called P2R. And P2R aims at showcasing a solution space for climate risk. But CLIMAAX, in this sense, delivers this input to the solution space. And third, the integrative approach opens many opportunities, but also challenges, such as combining quantitative and qualitative work and how to bring them together. Finally, also connecting communities and on-the-ground work with science is also something that is a challenge. But scientifically credible and impact-driven projects like CLIMAAX can support this. Finally, some two open questions that might be relevant maybe for the panel discussion. Bridging discourses, how can risk be better translated to resilience? And also bridging levels from local, regional, national, and from local to regional, national, and global. How do climate risk assessments and solutions interlink from different levels point of view? And also these 2 points are probably also important in the context of this upcoming cities report. That was my presentation. Thanks.
Yes, hello everybody. Now it's my time, person from Latvia. Hello everybody online as well. I hope that people online really are listening us and there are more people from Latvia. Okay, I saw some thumbs up. So yeah, there are Latvian people out there as well. So today I'm gonna introduce you about what are we doing here about climate risk analysis. And I'm from Meteo Center. And as you can see, my job title is data analyst / climatologist, actually. So mainly my job is based on the numbers, on calculations, like how climate has changed till nowadays, how it will look like in the future. So actually this project, CLIMAAX, and all the climate risk assessment part and that kind of stuff, it's something new for us. And it takes a lot of thought to think about it, and it sometimes takes us out of the comfort zone, but I guess that's what climate change is doing to all of us. It's taking us out of the comfort zone. So you already saw this kind of pictures. Yes, we do have climate risks in Latvia as well, and they may change from one place to another. For example, there is this river Daugava here in Riga. You may not see it in this kind of crisis, but at Jēkabpils, for example, last year there were quite a huge crisis, I'd say. And then there are many other climate risks in Latvia as well. Here is the climate risk assessment framework, which Michaela showed you just now. This is the old version. The one she showed you, this is something very new. But the main points are still the same. So the thing what I want to do is I want to go through this framework circle, and so you can see how we people who are not relevant to all this topic, we are quite new in this, but how we are dealing with these problems, how we are trying to go step by step further to manage all of the climate risk assessment. So the first step, it's the scoping step, and this is actually the part we already discussed in the previous slide. So we do have many kind of climate risks in Latvia. And the scoping part is the one where we are noticing what are the climate risks and which climate risks are maybe more affected and so on and so on. And here I could talk with all of the climate risks you see here, but I have to make an example with one of them. So this time I went to the coastal risks, because in Latvia we do have a quite a long coastline. We have almost 500 kilometers long coastline. That's why I chose to go to this climate risk. Of course, not all of the municipalities are scared of this risk, but this will be my example. So the next part is that CLIMAAX toolbox part, which Michaela showed as well. And here, when I'm looking into the frameworks, I can see there are two frameworks for the floods. So one is river floods and other is coastal floods. And of course, here in the workflows, the data is global. We are dealing with the global data sets. Today I'm going to introduce you with the coastal flood workflow and specific cases, what I saw if I'm looking at Latvia. So here are two results which are based on this framework, and these are, one case is for Pāvilosta, another is for Bernāti, and here we can see level how return periods are changing based on the floods and so on. But the main thing I want to mention here is something I'm going to read it because it's something that is written in the framework. So the flood modeling in this data set does not account for man-made coastal protection that may already be in place in population regions such as dams and storm barriers. For a more accurate estimate of coastal flood risks, it is recommended to perform local flood modeling, taking the results of the global model as the boundary conditions. Local models can take better account of complex bathymetry and topography and incorporate local data and knowledge about something such as flood protection measures. Why I wanted to add all of this information, it's because in my head, IPCC is like a head of all of this climate risk assessment of all of the policy things. Then there is a bit down of this is the CLIMAAX project, like we are looking at regional things, but still it is regional, but nobody will understand our place like us, people who are actually living here. That's why we need to add our own data. That's why Michaela also mentioned that there is this part when you can add your own data in the toolbox. So here is a thing what we already do have in Latvia. We have flood risk maps and we have analyzed how sea level will rise in Latvia based on the new climate change scenarios. So the perfect thing is so we can have this toolbox algorithm plus add our own data to improve it. And this is what we all have to do, because nobody from outside, like outside of Latvia, nobody will know where we have some dams or something. It's something what we have to add by ourselves into the data. So the next step is key risk assessment. Here I added a few of the questions, and these questions actually came from Michaela when I started to do all this climate risk assessment things. And when I read those questions, it is not easy to answer them. It's not easy to answer them if I'm doing it alone. And this is the part where I added few of the institutions. There could be more and more, but these institutions have to come together. We all have to come together to answer to this question. Me, myself, from like data analyst from a Meteo Center, I cannot answer to all of the questions. So we all have to come together to improve all of this. Next part is the monitoring part. And if we're getting back to the coastal things, then a few years ago, we had this new law in which we are monitoring climate change in Latvia. And there is a part where are different kind of indicators, and there is also indicators about sea, such as average sea level, coastal erosion, and so on. So this is one part how we are starting to do the monitoring part. Another thing is a new law that will be raised soon, but it's not out there yet, but we are already starting to deal with this. It's monitoring sea level and recalculating the buffer zone. And it is also something that goes together with the monitoring part. But then there is also risk evaluation. Here, this slide is in Latvian, and actually it doesn't matter what's written there, because a few slides ago I showed you that we have this law where we are monitoring different kind of climate indicators. And in this law there is another part where we are looking at 6 fields and how few years ago field experts did a research how based on climate change is changing some kind of indicators in their field. And this is you can see whether it correlates or it don't. But if we're looking at coastal problems, for now there isn't any kind of that indices. At least I don't know them. So this is one thing what we should do and what we can think about. But the good thing is that we have some of the fields that are starting to go this way. So for me it is harder to start. If we're starting something, then everything is going very well. And then there is again scoping part, because this is never-ending circle. When you are finishing up, you can see after, for example, you start to monitoring things, you see new things happening, and you understand, okay, I have to go another circle, and it will never end. Actually, once this starts, it never ends. So at this point, you can add another information. Here, that's why I added another story, another thing, coastal erosion, but it is another thing that is happening in Latvia. It's coastal erosion, and of course it is different process, but if I'm looking at, for example, municipalities, I see that people there, it is hard to add two different numbers for, in their minds, sometimes it's the same. Like flood risks near the coastline and coastal erosion. So in the far future, it would be very good to add all of this together, like CLIMAAX results. Then we can add our own knowledge, and then, for example, something from the coastal erosion. It would be very hard to do something like that, but in the future, it's something where we should go. So yeah, this was how I quickly wanted to jump through how we are dealing with this climate risk assessment part, and I'm very happy that we are in the CLIMAAX project, because yeah, Latvia, we are one of the pilots, which Michaela mentioned, and this framework is helping, at least for me, very much, because of the questions that is raising in my head, and finally I understand the way where I have to go, because of course I have read some papers from IPCC, but they are global papers. We have to go level by level and down to see what's happening actually in the cities as you are dealing these days. Okay, thank you very much for this.
Okay, wonderful. Hello to the online audience. My name is Matthias. I can actually be quite free in what I'm saying because I'm not part of the CLIMAAX project, but I try to be useful as nevertheless, of course. Congratulations, I think, to that very exciting toolbox, and many of the things I'll be discussing will be out of date after more municipalities have actually applied the toolbox. But nevertheless, maybe some interesting observations. I was asked by Bart to contribute a few thoughts on adaptation, particularly in cities. What do we now know about how adaptation is moving forward? What are some of the wicked problems, maybe, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to talk about three things quickly, more on the global scale. First, the current state of urban adaptation. This week is very much about cities, and I work a lot on cities in the university I work in, so I'll show a little bit of some global assessments on where do we stand with urban adaptation, what do we know about it. I will then talk a little bit about an issue that also came up in our discussions. I think that also for Latvia and for Europe is very important. That's the particular role of small and mid-sized cities. I actually also work a lot in large-scale cities, Manila, Saigon, and so forth. Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, Bangkok, but also on small and mid-sized cities, and we would see that this is very important. And then apart from that global view, I will then just highlight, I think, three examples of adaptation challenges. Again, this time not so much from the Asian and African perspective where I work most, where adaptation is actually most needed, and also cities are growing the fastest, but more from European projects, which also increasingly in my team in Munich we are doing. And we'll see that some of the problems in adaptation are actually offside sort of the technical questions, and maybe also offside where data can really really help us. Let's start quickly, current state of urban adaptation. I'd like to draw on a figure that we have actually presented in the last assessment report, where based on a very thorough view of all the published case study material on urban adaptation or on adaptation in principle, everything that's in the peer literature basically, we try to see how we're moving forward in adaptation. And we also did this, and I just zoom in here according to world regions and according to different fields, and cities is one of them. And you see in the figure here that we talk about depth, scope, and I would say speed for the moment of adaptation. That's important because the IPCC assessment showed us basically, and I think the examples you showed also show that very clearly, that oftentimes the changes in terms of hazards and other risks are so rapid and so deep that our beaten tracks of risk management will reach their limits. And so the question is, how deep and how fast do we actually move in adaptation? And whilst we see that a lot of adaptation is happening, many things have been done over the last 10 and 15 years, many good things have been tested. Overall, we see also in Europe that particularly in cities also, there is still sort of a lack of really deep adaptation, meaning also deep institutional change and land use legislation and so forth. Speed and scope are things actually being rolled out coherently, let's say, over different cities. But a lot is changing here in this, so it will be very important in this assessment cycle to redo this and to see that we're moving forward. But still, I think there's things to improve. Maybe first thing. We then looked in another study, which is drawing on a similar data set, also published case studies across the globe, who's actually adapting. And I think also here there's some, and what are the actors we need to talk to, and who's doing that. And I think something quite interesting is happening. You see on the left-hand side the different actors that we see reported in the literature from individuals and then civil society organization, all the blue segments here on different government institutions. And you see that actually the picture is quite different for urban and rural regions. So you could say there's a positive and a negative interpretation. Governments and government organizations are much more active in urban, let's say, adaptation. They play a stronger role there. You could also say in many of the rural parts, farmers and smallholder farmers and livelihoods and individual households are left to their own adaptation much more increasingly. You also see differences in world regions. I think that's quite different and quite interesting. But in Europe, you see that we actually have to talk to a lot of different actors, and many different actors are, of course, involved in adaptation. And I think that's important for us also in moving forward, because always the question is, who should be playing what role also? What are roles and responsibilities? And I'll not talk too much about it, but basically we see based on empirical research also there's quite a tacit shift in the negotiation about roles and responsibilities happening. My argument is, as a social scientist, we sometimes, and as a planner, we sometimes don't understand it too well. I'll be coming back to it in one of the case studies to show you a little bit what it means. In yet another study drawing on a similar data set, we then look in particular into coastal cities. You mentioned coastal cities for the Baltic states, of course, quite relevant. And we see here the case studies that are published in the literature. How is adaptation moving forward in coastal cities? And just to mention that you see quite a few interesting things happening. Some cities really get a lot of attention, others not. And you see particularly, that's important for the next argument, then particularly in Africa and Asia also, small and mid-sized cities are somehow lacking from the picture, even though we know that they are so important in hosting so many people and growing so rapidly. Also here we did the same thing, basically looking for the depth, the scope, and the speed of adaptation. Take it with a pinch of salt. That is we're currently revising it after review, but the preprint is out. But by and large, we see a similar picture. A lot is happening. Is it deep enough? Is it quick enough? And is it happening with a consistent scope? Is a question currently. So something for us also to ask, how can we accelerate this, move it forward, make it deeper institutional shifts, transformations, and so forth. One particular thing I'd like to highlight then is we talked about risk assessment, and what do we know in these coastal cities, how risk assessments are being done and what is being considered. And I'm particularly interested in my research to look into the consideration of future trends, not just in hazards, but also future trends in exposure and vulnerability. For the cities, they really matter. Many cities grow into already existing floodplains. And we see an interesting thing happening. We see the yellow bars here actually meaning in the hazard spectrum. I think I don't have a pointer, but on the top you see the hazard spectrum and how the current adaptation projects that we see reported in the literature consider future trends and hazards. And yes, quite a few consider past and current hazard patterns, but then also future hazard patterns. So the bluish and greenish bar parts here. But when it comes to people and infrastructure, exposure and vulnerability, in other words, this is not happening very much so. So we still combine very much, current exposure and vulnerability patterns with future hazard patterns, and that's of course problematic, and we really need to think also, what can we give to municipalities to improve that? What are the cookbooks, the guidebooks to do something like exposure scenarios, vulnerability scenarios, because that's what you have to adapt for. How does a coastal city look like in 20 years from now, also in terms of exposure? And this is also important. We talked in our meeting that we have downstairs for the past 2 days a little bit about what do different actors need to do. We then have we did another assessment here where we looked into national adaptation planning and how does urbanization, future trends in exposure and vulnerability also are picked up in national adaptation planning. And the chart is a little bit complicated, but basically you see the same thing happening. On the left-hand side is all things which are conceptually considered as being important. And on the right-hand side, you see what is actually being done in terms of scenario work, in terms of modeling and so forth. And you see that mostly hazards are only done into the future and not the rest. Also at the national scale. And of course, for national adaptation planning, urbanization and so forth matters a great deal. So quite a few things for the panel discussion, maybe just a few provocations. Where do we stand? What do we know? Where do we need to get better? A smaller block now and smaller mid-sized city in our cities. In our meeting, it has been raised quite often. These cities are so important and cities are growing. Let's first look into how cities are growing. And I was for a while when I was working at the United Nations University leading something that's called the World Risk Report. And we had sort of a global index of vulnerability in different countries. And in 1 year, we did an assessment just of the urban areas within countries. And we see quite a divided world, actually, in that those countries which have the highest vulnerability in their cities also are the ones, and that's you see on the top part of the figure, which have the most rapid urban growth. So the problems are really growing into the future, and that's a big, big challenge. And if you look a little bit more into different city classes then, and we did this in a paper, it needs some updating, but it's by and large still true, you would actually see that in terms of the urban vulnerability, the highest growth comes together or comes in small and mid-sized cities and often in those with the highest vulnerability. So that's really a segment we got to keep an eye out for globally. There's problems growing and emerging quite quickly, and we really have to ask what can we do in the short term and the midterm and the long term to address this. Let's move to the last block, some examples, and now a radical shift, if you wish. I'll shift into 3 projects we did on Europe, and I'm sorry, there I can mostly only offer Germany-based projects in that respect, since, again, my work is mostly on Asia and Africa. But anyway, three provocations in Europe, and I'll just, just some highlights, not very coherent, but just a couple of interesting things to think about. In one of those projects, we think about heat in the city and future trends also in heat vulnerability. You see here a picture of Bonn, where we did a lot of work, and Bonn had many record-breaking heat waves and so forth. So think about it when you come to the next climate talks, maybe to think this. We asked, as part of this project, planners around Germany in municipalities, what information do you currently use in your planning? And what information do you think would be interesting, but you're not using it yet in your planning? And 3 blocks, and I think that's quite interesting when it comes to heat. Of course, we have the big thing, the typical things that when it comes to heat and urban planning, everybody talks about: urban green spaces, urban climate, building renovation, age of buildings, and so forth. And already there is a gap between what people think is important and what they really consider in their day-to-day work. There's already a gap there. But the gap is getting much more wide if you think about vulnerability issues. Where do my elderly people live? Where are my infants? What's my health infrastructure and so forth? The gap is even widening. So the question is, in toolboxes and so forth, how can we improve that? Are there standard tools to assess these things? And this is just the status quo, not even the future trends. And then there's even more interesting and soft stuff, which we know from social sciences is very important for risk reduction. Things like risk perception, social cohesion in neighborhoods and so forth. Very hard for cities to grasp, to get even information on, and then to sort of advance that further to somehow trigger social cohesion, neighborhood networks and so forth to overcome heat wave situations, for instance. Quite an interesting finding, I think. A second thing, we work on flash floods quite a bit, and here now move into cities, Garmisch-Partenkirchen, some of you might know, which are close to the Alps, so they have a lot of flash flood problems. And one of the challenges and wake-up calls, of course, for Germany was that in the past we did planning based on these maps. That's the 1 in a 100-year flood event. And then the R Valley flood, which some of you might have heard 2 years ago happened, and where all of a sudden we got a flood event which was a 1,000-year flood event or even more extreme, as much as we can tell. Garmisch, quite a rich community, had spent a lot of money to make itself safe against the 100-year flood event. 2 years ago, the eye-opener comes that in what are we doing with these extreme events, which we had always modeled as part of the German legislation, but more for the cupboard. Nobody was really using it. Now there's a big question how to use this. And increasingly now under the new German climate adaptation law, cities are also now asked to prepare maps on their flash floods, heavy precipitation flash floods. So this is river floods, this is heavy precipitation flash flood events, and yet other parts of the city come in. So how do you deal with that massive, I mean, this is quite a change from here to there. That was always considered, yeah, let the climate scientists talk, not our reality. We don't have to implement it in planning. Now there's a realization we need to implement that in planning. Where are limits to adaptation? Where does the community have to say, or the municipality, we can't do this. We have to shift responsibility to individual house owners. What role does insurance have to play and so forth? Some of the concrete challenges we currently face. And then you could say, let's communicate, let's do education and awareness raising and so forth. And again, we ask in the region, all of the local municipalities, how do they actually think about what is problematic or non-problematic in terms of sharing some of that information. And it's quite interesting. So we're now modeling, we're doing more risk assessments, flood hazard maps and so forth, but it's seen largely as a problem. There's a high expectation of residents that the city administration should act. There's a high fear that citizens overreact. There's a high fear that citizens misinterpret these maps and so forth. High costs of protective measures that would follow. So there's actually a disincentive sort of to communicate these maps, whilst at the same time you should do it for awareness raising. A wicked problem. How do we deal with that? No clear answers here, but maybe we can pick it up in the panel discussion. But quite some interesting, I think, insights empirically into some of the upcoming problems. Last example, we did a big project in the Cologne area, where basically we looked into complex risks. And complex risks here is really one where you have a major flood event, and the flood event will actually cause the electricity to go down, and then immediately after 24 hours, water supply goes down because we have changed to electric water pumps in most of those areas. And we asked here, basically we did some research, what do we do in such a complex risk environment, who should act and so forth. Quite an interesting project. The German government gives out indications to say, you know, residents should be active, should be ready for such a situation, should stockpile food and so forth. This was largely ridiculed in the media and in the press. For those who can read German, it's quite funny what they did out of this and so forth, Hamsterkäufe and so, quite funny, but it was ridiculed basically. And the question is, who's responsible for such a situation? I just show you one highlight and then I wrap up. One finding was here, we asked who should be in such a situation where electricity and water goes down, who should be responsible for coming and helping you? Is it your own responsibility, you with your neighbors, or do you need some external support and do you need some government coming in or so forth? Now, the standard assumption is, we talk about most vulnerable populations, that the old people and so forth, they would be the ones who say, well, if somebody's sort of eligible for external help, it should be me and so forth. The contrary is the case. We're looking here into Cologne, a big student city, and you see the red elements where basically the elderly say, no, I'm responsible, all the bluish stuff, and the red segment says only a small proportion would say, primarily I think that somebody else should be responsible for me. But the younger you get and you get to students, the more there's the assumption nowadays that some external help will come in. At the same time, municipalities are overstretched already. There's a social contract issue here looming, a misinterpretation of roles and responsibilities big time. We need to unlock that. We need to really get serious and explicit about it. We do a lot of research on those things, but quite an interesting finding. Again, a wicked problem somehow that we need to tackle. I'll wrap up a couple of conclusions. Urban climate change adaptation efforts are on the rise across the globe. Many lessons can be learned from tracking current efforts. I've just shown you some highlights. While many new approaches are being tested in cities, current adaptation is overall not yet of sufficient scope, speed and depth, and that needs to change. While lots of attention has been put on large mega cities, we really need to focus on the small and mid-sized cities. I hope this became clear somehow. Many adaptation barriers on the ground can be understood through detailed case studies across different settings. And so hence in our meeting downstairs, we're really trying to think how can we synthesize very different case studies to be useful. And I think hopefully the 3 flashlights showed a little bit the breadth of problems that we can learn from case studies. They show that many knowledge gaps still exist in order to overcome wicked problems and difficult choices in urban adaptation governance. But many of these problems actually have to be tackled in nested approaches between actors at different scales. Thanks for your consideration and or attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. And I know it's probably everyone here is hungry, and I just beg you to wait another 30 minutes, and then you'll be rewarded with some food. Oh, food and drinks over there. I lost my pen. Can I ask all the speakers to come to the front of the stage and to sit down? We'll have 30 minutes of a discussion now. We're going to kickstart with some commentary from two discussants we haven't heard from. Would you also like to come, Michaela? And we also have an online discussant. So what I will ask for is, first, can we check that Anna is online? And if so, happy to, oh, perfect. Lovely. So I'd like to introduce Anna Prani from CMCC and also formerly IPCC, and also Reinhard Mechler from IASA. And both are also involved in the CLIMAAX project. So first, to kickstart the conversation, while you think of questions, and definitely do bring them up, I'd like to ask Reinhard maybe to have some reflections on what Matthias has just raised, which was a very rich presentation. But one of the things that you raised were that there are different adaptation actors in different contexts, so cities versus rural areas, and also that there's different, I imagine they would have different information needs, and that there's information that people say they need, but they're not using. So Reinhard, I'd like you to reflect a little bit about this question of information and our users. So what information do we actually need on climate risk? And then how do we get different users to act on that information?
Yeah, thanks, Inta. I'll try to respond to that question and focus a bit on the CLIMAAX project. And we are just also in the CLIMAAX project, we are just have a cascading fund call out. So we set up the tool, the framework, and now we are reaching out to European regions and cities, and we got 130 proposals in. And so I wanted to build on these proposals and the information needs that are stipulated in these proposals. Maybe to quickly go a little bit into that question. Of course, that's a killer question. I cannot really answer that, but I thought I wanted to do it around maybe 4 elements, unless somebody stops me quickly. Maybe quickly, who are those, where are those coming from, these proposals coming from? They're coming from small cities or small sets of cities and regions. So it's not the big cities, and it's also not country level. So it's really going more to the local level. And I think that's also what we also like from the presentations earlier, that there's a key gap here. So that's very interesting. So the feedback that I'm gathering, and of course that's totally unscientific, what I'm doing is like incipient comments, and we'll be following up on that with a user survey. But I thought a few comments could be useful that I bring in. Maybe start with that approach that we're taking in the CLIMAAX project, the motto, the mantra that Bart started, so the standardized flexibility. I personally was quite skeptical about that term. I didn't understand it in the beginning, but now I like to really, I think it's really interesting. And it's being picked up, I think, also in those proposals. What is it, right? We got standards. We got standards on risk assessment. We got standards on risk frameworks, how to do it. We got standards on risk assessment, how to run it, how to compute it. And then we're adding, of course, also data, standardized data that are being generated by national level or global institutions, IPCC being one of those. And then the idea is there should be flexibility that then those communities or municipalities, regions that are coming in, they will feed their own data in. I was personally really skeptical, would that happen, right? Do people have this capacity to do Python coding and stuff like that? But it looks like now from the proposals we are getting that this approach is really being taken up. So it seems that in these groups that are being proposed for these individual grants, 200,000, 300,000, that there's 1 or 2 experts in these groups that can run those things. And then there's quite a few people, stakeholders, that understand why we are running those. And then there's also policy or practice people in those things. Maybe it's working. I shouldn't be too positive here for Bart. It's too easy. But I think somehow it's working, and that's at least for the proposals. We need to see what that means then finally as we apply it. Maybe a second comment, how many, like, also that question, what information do we need? And I think IPCC would also say we need a lot of information. We need multiple risk information, compound risk, cascading risk, and these kind of things. And indeed, what we are seeing back from these proposals, that those cities or regions really want to get information on multiple risks. That's certainly popping up. It's not one risk usually, but it's flooding, heat, storm. These are popping up, and so these are very important. And of course, they would like to have multi-hazard assessment, so everything is integrated. But I think multiple risk or multiple hazard risk assessments are also okay, and that's probably what we are currently doing. But we're also evaluating whether we can do multi-hazard or compound, and maybe complex risk assessment. And I think Anna has a comment on that later on. So I think we are seeing that also. It's one hazard, one risk is not good enough. We need to do more. Also, Matthias, yeah, we haven't met in a while. Yeah. Matthias talked about those really infrequent events. So also from some of these proposals, I hear people want to hear about the 1,000-year event. So really want to hear about these very infrequent things. And that's a little bit outside of the standards quite often. So should we look into that? Users tell us, yes, you should. And of course, the uncertainty is massive for a 1,000-year event. Go back 1,000 years in Latvia, what did we have here, right? So the 1,000 years is massive. Maybe two quick comments, Sinta, also before you stop me. Also, we should allow a little bit for subjectivity. So the standard assessment is objective risk. We crunch the numbers and here's the result. We should also allow for subjectivity, that people can actually also ask or put their own perspectives in. What is it? So how do the impacts affect gender? What is it like income status? And also, some other aspects that are very important also given that we talk about marginal communities also in what we are doing here. So also this subjective versus objective risk, there should be a bit of flexibility here, I think. Fourth point, we need to be solutions driven. The CLIMAAX project is about risk assessment, but that's not good enough, as we know, because risk management and risk assessment is all linked. So we also need to be talking about solutions, nature-based solutions, urban planning, and other stuff, and that's also what people want, and that's also what we can do in the CLIMAAX project to some extent, but only with some indices or some aggregate information. But we can also hand over to this twinning or sister project that sister projects, where Michaela mentioned one project, the P2R project. So also really have the solutions focus. That's also seems to be very important. So that's it from my end. Maybe it was a bit, I don't know. Hopefully it was somewhat useful for the discussion, and it took a bit longer, yeah. Thanks.
Well, thanks for joining us and coming all the way to Riga. It's great to have all this expertise from around Europe here. So Anna, just building on that, from what I understand, and I'm not involved with the CLIMAAX project, have been involved with IPCC risk assessments. However, there is a kind of a standard framework that you're using to assess risks in different contexts. And as Reinhard mentioned, and also as Matthias mentioned, one of the increasing issues is, people don't just deal with heat waves. We're dealing with multiple climate hazards, often in succession, very short period of time, one after the other, sometimes at the same time, often along with disease outbreaks like COVID or other kind of hazards that we need to consider. So, how are you considering cascading or compound risks in the CLIMAAX work and in your particular context?
Okay, thanks, Zinta. I hope you can hear me. And
Yep.
I'm sorry for being so large on the screen. It's a bit embarrassing, but it's really special to be able to join remotely this group. I'm actually not going to talk about the CLIMAAX project. My intention was to step back again in a way and give a bigger picture. So I was really hoping to pick up on the starting point of this discussion, which came from Bart. He talked about mission adaptation. And I'm going to come round at the end of all these contributions, looking at a product that the European Commission has driven, and that's the first European climate risk assessment, EUCRA. And Michaela mentioned it was published just in March. And I think it's really nice to speak about these kind of European or region-wide approaches, because I really liked something that Dasha said, which is we all have to come together. And this is also what CLIMAAX is doing. It's trying to bring everyone along to come together. And we have to bridge these scales, which is almost the hardest part, I would say. So what at the European scale, this climate risk assessment did, it evaluated risks across Europe in the context of severity, but also the policy context, policy readiness, policy horizon, and risk ownership. So it's talking about how we move into action and whether we are prepared or not at the European scale. And the report, I think, is very interesting also from an IPCC perspective, as laying a kind of a step forward from the European chapter in the last assessment. And so it systematically assessed climate-related risks. It identified 36 major risks in Europe. around 5 main clusters: ecosystems, food, health, infrastructure, economy, and finance. And it's impressive to see that more than half of these risks in Europe they demand action, essentially, and some of them are particularly urgent, especially in relation to ecosystems and health. And one aspect that the report highlights is that more information is needed on vulnerability of people and ecosystems. So picking up on what Matthias was saying very much. So I think going forwards, this is a dimension that we're not covering sufficiently in European context. So the consideration of non-climatic risk drivers alongside climatic drivers is really an opportunity to be able to make progress in addressing climate-related risks. So the report is picking up on the issue that you just asked originally, Zinta, about the many complex interactions that we see that cut across the different sectors. So we've not only undertaken assessment and a mapping of the climate impact chains in these different sectors, we've also looked at trying to map the interlinkages across them and how these risks cascade. So I think a key innovation has been to try and look at risk transmission pathways. But the challenge has been, from my experience looking at this process, is communicating a risk assessment that's looking at risk transmission pathways. So it's not a sort of standard risk assessment where we look at severity and things like that. It's looking at how the risks propagate. And I think this is a question that we're going to have to also address in the IPCC context. And one dimension of how we look at it in the UCRA context, which we're not doing at the moment in CLIMAAX. I think it's just early days and perhaps something worth considering. In addition to looking at future scenarios and how conditions may change in this century, we should also consider the sort of low probability but plausible outcomes. And Reinhard just mentioned them. Also, Matthias picked this up. The things that could plausibly happen could be around the corner, but we can't model them in the same way as we would traditional risk assessment using future projections of climate change and how it affects different climatic impact drivers. So we've really tried to implement a storylines approach. So we look at plausible outcomes that build different insights. So it's both quantitative and qualitative. And communicating this is a challenge. And I was just really interested to see how in the original Menti questions that you put up at the beginning of the session, education actually stood out as the biggest enabler or the biggest, it came out the most, shall we say, in how participants of this event are addressing climate risk. So we've got a long way to go. And I think it's a conversation that bridges from the project level of CLIMAAX, but through UCRA, hopefully we can also contribute into the IPCC thinking. And just to conclude my intervention, and one of the reasons I wanted to highlight UCRA is that it highlights how cooperation is essential, and it bridges the regional scale, the national scale, and down to local levels, so that there's a coordinated action going forwards. So I think that's a challenge, and it'd be worth discussing further how that's actually done. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, I have a lot of questions for everyone, and also I'm sure that you yourselves would like to comment on presentations. But first, I want to open up to anybody here in the audience. Do you have any questions for the speakers, thoughts on how risks are handled here? Or I know we have guests from abroad, so where you are, just raise your hand. Oh, perfect. We have a microphone coming. And also, if there are any online questions, then feel free to let us know.
Thank you, Zinta. So my name is Abdallah Muksit. I am secretary of IPCC, but this time I am not speaking as IPCC secretary, but former general director of meteorological department and colleague from Meteo, is representing. Sometimes I feel I'm in family. So I think that this outreach activity is about project. Regional project funded by European Union. I think all the ingredients for key of success are there. And this is Europe. Me, I am Moroccan from Africa. And this is something we should really think about. It is when we are thinking about a project, we are putting all the resources to ensure success. When you are in normal life, a developing country, you are facing the risks. And it is not about the capacity to anticipate about risk, how to assess. It is also about the capacity to have the means to react and to find solution. So my first comments, and this is what I introduced when we were dealing with some risk in Morocco, in Casablanca as big city, is we shouldn't add one word which is coherent with IPCC. Rather than speaking about risk management, we should also include knowledge risk management. Knowledge risk management. The word knowledge is the word that can take the opportunity to bring all the information and to try to add some anticipation, proactive action to allow those governments to react. The other thing which is really important is when you are installing such reaction, you are looking for, in terms of meteorology, you need the capacity to have a good observation, data, a good forecast, not only for just immediate nowcasting, but also 3 days, 15 days, and also in the future. And this is something that should ensure also sustainability. You have CLIMAAX, but it is project. I am sure in Europe you will have the possibility to continue ensuring funding. If you have the same example in another region, another continent like Africa, you should think about the possibility to ensure sustainability, and you should not close the project as soon as the funding is there. I just want to share with you one example, which is concrete also with climate change. No one of you who knows Casablanca in Morocco, not the movie, Casablanca. One time we did have one day all the rainfall that can happen in 1 year in Casablanca. More than 6 million in Casablanca, big city. At limit, with this 240 millimeter a day, 1 day, this, make Casablanca as a swimming pool. But believe me, and this is what is connected. It was a swimming pool 1 day, but the following day, it was really managed. Why? And this is very important thing. It just, that time, I was general director, and the team in our forecast team, we are running limited area models and so on, told me, Mr. Moksit, the rules are saying if we have to launch the warning, we have just 24 hours. But now 3 days in advance, can we launch this warning? I told him, yes. In 3 days, and this is knowledge. Launching the warning 3 days in advance, this allowed what you showed in your, all the actors, mainly the one, managing, this reservoir, these canals and so on. 3 days in advance allowed them to clean all these places in Casablanca. As soon as the rain, made Casablanca a swimming pool, all these systems were working well. In 24 hours, I think everything was managed. And this is something that shows 240 millimeters in Casablanca. It is an extreme event. And this will be accelerated in the future. That means even the risks themselves will, amplify in the future. And it is a changing system. So this is kind of thing I want to share with you. And I think this is a very important thing. So
No, thank you for sharing your experience. And we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to also, I saw there was other questions, but I just want to one of the questions I actually have for the panel, and maybe this is for Datsa, because you mentioned that this is, you know, the capacity building involved. This is the first time that you've done some of these things. So what I'd love to also hear from you, but first maybe we'll go to the next question, but you know, is what is the applicability, or like what are the lessons from this project, or that you could share for other countries, or are there any kind of the things you've learned from this that could about capacity building, and could it be applied to other countries? Sorry, that's not very clear, but hopefully.
Yes, thank you. I think I understand the question. I guess for me, the main thing what I got out is that really we need to work together, because previously the things I had to do in my job, it was like I can do it by myself. I can take the data somewhere online. I can do something. I can take our observation data, do all kind of stuff, read some papers, so on, so on. But if we're talking about climate risks and how to adapt to them, then we need, first of all, of course, those data, but we also need stakeholders. We also need society to reply to our questions. What is the main things that should be, like where we should start and how we should start. And we need to get all the people on the same page so we can start at the same point. We all understand, for example, this your example when you said that based on your forecast, everything worked well because society believed in you. And that is also one of the things that is sometimes not so good, that society, we can do whatever we want, we can make whatever laws we want, but if the society don't want to believe in us, then it's a bad thing. So yeah, but in this project, I really understood that we have to go together, we need to think together, and go in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, hopefully some of those lessons can be applied more globally as well. And as you mentioned, the importance of education and working together. But there was another hand up, so I just want to make sure that we can get to the other questions. And we have about 10 minutes left, so try to keep the questions short.
It continues on the question that you already raised, but I was wondering, the CLIMAAX project, what is the eventual goal? Is it supposed to also be able to use by other cities or regions? Because as you said, it was very useful, but you have a lot of connection also with Michel, I think. What I see very often, that we have a lot of tools that are being developed, but if you do not have a person that helps you using these tools in the first place, then it's really difficult as a city to work with these tools and they're not being used. So it's great that there's a European project that kind of helps you to do this, but do you think other cities could also use it without the help of a CLIMAAX project to use the tool itself?
Maybe I can start and then you can comment on this as well. The reason why I got this help from Michaela was because we're the pilots and we started this project when there was like nothing in it, like there was nothing in framework, nothing in toolbox, and we started at the beginning when people from the framework part and the toolbox part, they were doing their jobs, inventing their tasks. And that's why at that point there wasn't clear what actually should be in those phases I showed you. And that's why Michaela, she was the one who started to do the framework part, and I guess those questions were just raising in your head when you were thinking about the framework, and that's why she asked those questions to me. But if we're looking further, there will be this framework written down, and there might be some kind of questions also outside, and there will be these examples from us, from pilots. So I guess each region can definitely see how we did it and do it on our example. But before us, there wasn't any example. That's why we got those questions.
Now it works? Yes. Yeah. Great. Yeah, thanks, Datsa. I think this are some good points. And as I showed earlier, in the handbook is online. I mean, there are two versions right now, but it will be updated. And the handbook can be used by everyone. And the workflows, so the codes, can also be used by everyone. But in the CLIMAAX project, we have this funding that allows the applicants to also pay experts who are able to run the code, because of course not everyone, as also Reinhard said, not everyone is able to understand a Python code. But in theory, everything is online and everyone can also use it. And the guiding questions that Dace said, they will also be online. So the framework and the theory is there to be used. And also only for Europe, unfortunately, the data is also there and can be used. And for experts, they can also include their own data. So in theory, it can be used for everyone. It's open source and for everyone.
In the interest of time, we're going to see if there's any other questions. So that perfect.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask a very practical question, that working with risk assessments on national and also on local level, we see a really big problem with the data on vulnerability. While data on hazards is getting better and better, and we have very good data sets also in Latvia. In the last like 6-7 years, it has improved significantly, but while social data seems to be lagging behind. And when you work with municipalities, they lose credibility if we don't show them the vulnerability on like a spatial scale. What is the spatial distribution of vulnerable these elements, vulnerable communities? And I noticed that, for example, for environmental data, we have the regulations and we have legal requirements how to depict it, but we don't have the same kind of legal requirements and incentives for this social, economic, and health data, and how to facilitate that it kind of improves on the same level as climate and environmental data.
I'll maybe direct that to Matthias, also because I have a question for you. You mentioned in your talk about the need to fill the kind of the future knowledge of vulnerability and exposure. We're great at modeling hazards, not so good with that as well. So maybe if you can address that question and share your thoughts on how we could fill that gap in, modeling of vulnerability and exposure in future.
Yeah. And of course, the first part is already complicated enough, and then you add even an additional layer to it. It's not easy, I think, is the answer. And if it was so easy, then certainly we wouldn't observe that there is this like. But a couple of things, I think. I mean, some of it is easier than we think. So, for instance, really going out and mapping. Let's start at the infrastructure level, of course. Where do you have vulnerable infrastructure that is exposed? Your hospitals, your elderly homes, and so forth. Your kindergartens, all of that stuff. That is usually, I mean, we did similar toolboxes and so forth on the German level, and it's quite interesting. That's a thing that can be quite easily done. Electricity provision and so forth, they're not so much. When it comes to the population level, that's indeed a big challenge. The answer that I find most coherent is actually the cities have the data, and there's no need to make it public or so, but to use it internally. And you wouldn't believe how much siloing there is in between or within cities even. We talked today a lot about actors and so forth. For us in some of those cities to get even the health department together with the one for social development and then the spatial planning guys, and to make their data set somehow coherent is already a challenge, and that they could do in principle. It's a different question whether they can publish it. So in Germany, for instance, very hard for them to publish. We were trying to figure out, for instance, where the elderlies, do they live in the top floors of the very heated and heat wave events and so forth, where it's getting very hot, and how much would we need for the emergency services, how big is the problem and so forth. We didn't get that data, but we know that city internally, at least, they could use it if they were working together a little bit more closely. So it's a little bit of a stage process. And how to move forward, that's actually, I think, academically super interesting. We work in my group, and I think there's a couple of other groups on vulnerability scenarios. We really try to do through, some of it is through modeling, and some of it is, I would say, through semi-quantified approaches to really think through different vulnerability trajectories. Mostly we do it for large urban areas also. Let's take Jakarta, and then to say in an SSP1 versus 3 world, where do population developments go, and with migration and informal settlements and so forth. And would be a little bit of a technical discussion now. There's quite some interesting papers and approaches coming up, for instance, to use Bayesian network approaches to do that sort of simulation work. So there's quite something that can be done, and I think we are much further ahead than only 5 years ago. But of course, a lot of that is still explorative for the moment, but still we can do something. And also here, I think the low-hanging fruit is to at least get cities to think about their own population projections, and to quantify it in space and so forth, and to think through if you think about the heat condition in 20 years from now, what population will there be in 20? And so there's much more we can do. And on that level, we work a lot on, as I said, semi-quantified and participatory scenario methods. And that work quite well, actually. There's a lot of knowledge that you can collect then. But it's not easy. I could also say it's an interesting academic frontier because not everything is clear yet, also methodologically.
Great. Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes left, and if not, I'm going to pose a question. No questions online? All right. Well, then just to wrap up, and then I'll invite all of you to enjoy some food and continue the questions and conversations. And also, I see that we have many participants here, I think, who are not in the IPCC meeting but have joined locally. I want to encourage all of you to engage with the IPCC, to join, to review the report that will be coming out of the city's report, to apply to be scientists, or they're also looking for practitioners or chapter scientists. So to come and engage, we need more Latvian input into the IPCC. But I'll end with maybe a bit of a cheeky question, because I actually have a lot of questions that to each of you that I can't ask. But since I started with like, what are the risks for the community? I'd be curious to hear from each of the speakers very quickly, in 30 seconds, what you think is the biggest risk that we need to be thinking about. And that could be, risks from maladaptation that we're not thinking about, or risks from, thinking too much about one thing. And what's your kind of guidance to the people here on either risks that we should be aware of or thinking about, or in our research and work going forward? Maybe it's a risk from a hazard, heat waves, but so I'll leave it open and you can interpret that question as you want, but what are your thoughts on risks that we should be keeping in mind for the next 4 years as we move forward with this work in the IPCC and CLIMAAX report?
Okay, if nobody is starting, then I can start. In my opinion, it could be knowledge differences. That is the risk, because a lot of times people who are writing the reports and so on, they live in this bubble where everybody understands what is climate, for example. But we have to remember that not all of the people understand what is climate, and not all of the people understand that it is changing and it is making differences. So I'd say first risk is the knowledge differences between people, between parts of the world, and so on.
Thanks.
You need to think. I would say erosion of social cohesion and collaboration. I think there's so much we can do if we work together across different disciplines, across different spectrums in societies and so forth, globally, quite frankly. And I'm a little bit concerned that this is eroding and it's getting a more and more diverted and heated debate. And that is not helpful for mobilizing knowledge, mobilizing funding and so forth, testing new approaches with an open sort of acceptance that we can also be wrong and do it again and so forth, all of that stuff. So that's what I'm a little bit concerned about, to be honest, or what I see at a risk.
If I may add to Matthias, I think I would agree with social cohesion. I think if society is able to hold together, I think we can overcome it. And if social cohesion is not given, I think it's difficult to overcome it.
Thanks. I'll pass to Anna if you're ready. I don't know if you are.
Yeah, thanks. That is nice to jump in. I would say future risk. While the IPCC does a very nice assessment of future risk and the famous burning embers, what I've personally been seeing in the CLIMAAX project, translating information about future scenarios into practice is really a challenge. And going down to the practice scale at the local level, bringing information from scenarios into the assessment of risk is really hampered by accessibility issues, also by the types of products that are just simply available. So flood maps, for example, of future sea level rise, there are just certain sets of products available, and it's very difficult for practitioners to do more sophisticated analyses without really investing in collaboration with academia. And so bridging the academic exploration of future risk with what is done in practice by our colleagues on the ground.
Maybe Reinhardt, and then we'll end with Bart, as you started.
Maybe and risk. I think a big risk is in these projects we are doing, or the engagement we are doing, that we don't reach out, and what Abdullah talked about, that we don't translate and build these communities of practices, because that was your question and some other questions. These projects will end also in Europe, but in other places. So we really need to make sure we build these communities of practices and translate this information that we are creating into practical stuff that has an afterlife and can be used over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, my take would be that maybe our limited memory is maybe our biggest risks, and it's also very difficult to prioritize the risk. And after an event, we are really able to respond, but to secure that consistency of the response to the further future, I think that is a very difficult approach. And that so the uptake capability is not only limited to, say, developing countries or countries where other topics are more prominent. Also in our society, so many pressures are there at the same time, and so many risks are there that the current governance cannot stay long enough to actually, internalize these risks for the next generation of governance. That we forget before we actually can remember, and that is, I think, a bit of a risk. So it's a bit of a I'm not sure. I would really wish our communities and societies, apart from indeed restoring some cohesion, etc., but also be creative. Train your ability to improvise and to move along with the always changing conditions. That's probably a very nice take on what resilience is about.
Well, thank you with those great words and new word additions to our word clouds. And we've grown it over the hour and a half. So thanks to the speakers, Paldies. Thank you to the audience, and invite you all to come have some snacks for being so patient and listening to our conversation. So thank you.
And thank you, Zinta.
Thanks.